Picture this: 2013. A startup lands investment from Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and Mark Zuckerberg at the same time. The idea is simple and wild at once. Build an artificial intelligence that sees the world the way the human brain does. Headlines scream that this is the company that will finally build real AGI. Less than a decade later, almost nobody remembers its name. Then there's another team, the very same people who built Siri for Apple, who get $200 million from Samsung to build an assistant smarter than Siri. You've definitely heard how that deal turned out. It's called Bixby, and you already know how few people actually use it. Today, when ChatGPT feels like it appeared out of nowhere in November 2022, it's easy to forget that before it, there was an entire lost world of AI startups. Dozens of companies, billions of dollars in funding, brilliant ideas, and almost total silence before OpenAI changed the rules of the game. Where did it all go? Why didn't any of these projects become the moment? And why, looking back now, do these stories explain exactly why the AI boom happened the way it did? This video is about 5 stories, 5 very different fates. One company worked on the same project for 40 years and never lived to see its final success. A second raised hundreds of millions on the promise of a brain in a computer and ended up packing boxes in warehouses. A third sold itself to a giant for $200 million and essentially dissolved inside it. A fourth cost one of the biggest tech giants on the planet billions of dollars in reputation. And the fifth turned out to be the exception that proves the rule, and it's the one that eventually led us to the world we live in today. Let's get into it. Before we dive into the specific stories, it's worth understanding one important thing about the history of artificial intelligence. This field has gone through not one but several waves of hype, and after each wave came what's known as an AI winter, a period when money, attention, and trust suddenly disappeared because the promises turned out to be too big for what the technology could actually deliver. The first winter hit in the 70s. The second came in the late 80s and early 90s. But the period we're interested in today, roughly 2010 to 2022, wasn't a winter in the classic sense. It was a time when deep learning actually started working, image recognition, language processing, games like Go. Money poured in. Startups were born by the dozen. And at the same time, almost none of them became the breakthrough everyone expected. Why? Because most of these companies tried to solve too ambitious a problem too early. They wanted to build general artificial intelligence, AGI, long before the technology that could actually get close to it even existed, large language models based on transformers. That architecture, by the way, only appeared in 2017, and Google's attention is all you need paper. And it still took another 5 years before anyone turned it into a product that ordinary people would understand and love. So this entire lost period is essentially a story about people who guessed the right direction, but not the right moment. And about a few exceptions that laid the groundwork for what came next. Let's start with the longest and, in a way, the most tragic story in this video. A computer scientist named Douglas Linnet launches a project called Psych, short for encyclopedia. The idea sounds elegant. If you manually encode all of human common sense, all those obvious things we know but never say out loud, like if you let go of an apple, it falls, or a person can't throw an apple into space, then a computer will finally be able to reason as flexibly as a human being. Linnet already had a reputation as a genius by that point. He'd created programs called AM and Eurisco, which won awards for finding unconventional tactics in games and math problems. The logic was simple. Earlier systems ran out of steam once they exhausted their initial set of rules. So if you gave a system a large enough base of background knowledge, it should be able to reason about almost anything. Leonard expected it would take 10 years. It took 40. Psych began life under the umbrella of the MCC Consortium in Austin, Texas. In 1994, Linnet spun the project off into its own company, PsyCorp, and kept working on it until his death in 2023. Over that time, the team hand-coded more than 25 million assertions covering roughly 1.5 million concepts. It's genuinely one of the largest and longest-running projects in the history of artificial intelligence. And yet, it never truly took off. Commercial applications stayed fairly modest. Psych was sold as a knowledge analysis tool for pharma, intelligence work, and corporate databases, and the company did survive on the market for decades, paying salaries, staying afloat. But the moment when Psych would become the foundation for a new generation of smart systems simply never arrived. What went wrong? Here it helps to understand a fundamental problem with the symbolic approach to AI. Psych tried to encode knowledge by hand, rule by rule, fact by fact. That's incredibly labor-intensive and, as it turned out, fundamentally limited. The real world is too chaotic, too full of exceptions and nuance, to be fully captured by formal logic. Meanwhile, in parallel with Psych, a completely different approach was developing: neural networks, which don't receive rules as pre-packaged facts, but learn on their own from massive amounts of data. That approach is the one that ultimately won. When deep learning started delivering results in the 2010s, symbolic AI like Psych began to look like an interesting but dead-end path. Researcher Gary Marcus, who knew Linnet personally, wrote something very precise after his death. Psych was neither a total success nor a total failure. It was a groundbreaking, clarion experiment that never fully gelled. And he added an important detail. Almost no AI project has ever survived on the market for 40 years straight. In that sense, Psych is a story of one person's extraordinary persistence, someone who believed in his idea longer than almost anyone else in the field. Interestingly, in the age of large language models, the conversation around Psych has gotten a second wind. LLMs can generate text that looks like common sense, but they don't actually have the explicit logical structure that Linnet spent decades building. Some people in the industry are now seriously discussing whether a hybrid of symbolic knowledge bases and neural networks is exactly what modern AI is missing. Which means an idea that seemed buried under the weight of its own ambition might yet make a comeback. But that's a different story. The second story is about a company that, on paper, had everything it needed to become the next big name in AI. Two co-founders, Scott Phoenix and Dilip George, launch a startup called Vicarious. The idea: build an AI system based not on abstract math, but on the actual working principles of the human brain, specifically the visual cortex. Their technology was called the Recursive Cortical Network, a system meant to mimic how a human recognizes images and video. The ambitions were enormous. In its early materials, the company stated outright, the goal was to achieve human-level intelligence in vision. Not just recognize cats in photos better than the competition, but literally recreate the way the brain processes visual information. And investors believed it. Not just any investors, either. The list of people who put money into Vicarious includes Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, and Samsung. In total, the company raised more than $200 million across several rounds. That wasn't just money. It was a public bet made by some of the most influential people in tech, that this exact team would come closest to building real artificial general intelligence. The company even showed off impressive results. Its system could crack CAPTCHAs, those visual, "I'm not a robot" tests, with an accuracy that shocked the industry at the time. It felt like the beginning of something huge. And then something happened that happens to a lot of ambitious AI startups. Reality turned out to be more complicated than the promise. The recursive cortical network never scaled to a level that could compete with the deep learning approaches that were, at the very same time, rapidly advancing at Google, Facebook, and dozens of other labs. And sometime in the mid-2010s, Vicarious began a quiet, but fundamental transformation. Instead of human-level general intelligence, the company started offering warehouse logistics solutions, robotic arms that pack boxes, sort goods, and perform so-called kitting, assembling product bundles for e-commerce companies. These were real, working, commercially in-demand products. But they were nothing like what Bezos, Musk, and Zuckerberg had put their money into in the early years. In April 2022, just months before the release of ChatGPT, Vicarious was acquired by Intrinsic, a robotics subsidiary of Alphabet. Terms of the deal weren't disclosed, but by most estimates, the sum was far more modest than what the company's early years had promised. What's the telling detail here? Vicarious didn't go bankrupt. It didn't vanish without a trace. It found itself a real niche, industrial robotics, and ended up becoming part of a larger company, where it still exists today. But the path from "we're going to build a brain that sees the world like a human" to "we're going to automate package handling in a warehouse" is, in a way, the most precise metaphor for what happened to an entire generation of AGI startups in the 2010s. A grand vision collided with technological reality, and the company either adapted to something more practical or disappeared entirely. The third story is probably the most ironic of the four, because it's about people who had already built something genuinely successful once and tried to do it again. Remember Siri? Before Apple bought the technology in 2010, it was built by a small team that included Adam Cheyer and Dag Kitlaus. After the sale, both of them spent a few years at Apple and then decided to try again, this time without the constraints of a huge corporation. In 2012, they founded Viv Labs. The goal was ambitious even by the standards of this list: build not just a voice assistant, but what they themselves called a global brain, a system that could order you pizza, book a restaurant table, plan your schedule, all without a single human on the other end. Essentially, they were trying to build what Siri was supposed to become but never did, held back by the constraints of Apple's corporate structure. The tech industry took Viv very seriously. Demos of the system impressed insiders. This was the same team that had already proven it knew how to build products like this, and now they were doing it without compromise. In October 2016, Samsung acquires Viv Labs for roughly $215 million. And this is where the most interesting part of the story begins. Viv's technology was supposed to become the foundation of Samsung's next-generation voice assistant, Bixby. At first, both companies said Viv would operate as an independent subsidiary within Samsung, preserving its own startup culture. Kitlaus even publicly said, "Samsung will dramatically accelerate our vision." But reality turned out differently. The first version of Bixby, released in 2017 alongside the Galaxy S8, didn't include any Viv technology at all. It was a separate product, built entirely inside Samsung, and it got a cold reception, a limited set of commands, clumsy integration, weak third-party app support. Only a year later, with the release of Bixby 2.0, did Samsung finally start integrating Viv's technology, mostly to improve interaction with third-party services. But by then, the moment had already passed. By that point, Google Assistant, Amazon Alexa, and even Siri itself had already captured most of the user attention, and Bixby remained the assistant people mostly used because a physical button on the phone got pressed by accident in their pocket. In 2020, Adam Cheyer, the very same co-founder who had been there at the origins of both Siri and Viv, left Samsung. This coincided with rumors that the company was considering dropping Bixby entirely in favor of Google Assistant as part of a new deal with Google. That didn't actually happen. Bixby technically still exists, but it never got anywhere near the cult, revolutionary status Viv was supposed to give it. What makes this story especially telling is that there was no technology failure here. The team had already proven its competence by building Siri. The problem was something else entirely. A brilliant idea, once absorbed into a massive corporate machine, dissolved into internal politics, competing teams, and slow decision-making. Sometimes the biggest risk for an AI startup isn't technological failure. It's a successful exit into a deal that kills the very thing the company was bought for. The fourth story is different from the others in one key way. It's not a startup. It's one of the biggest tech giants on the planet. And that's exactly why its failure ended up being the most expensive one, in dollar terms, of everything we're talking about today. February 2011. Millions of Americans tune in to watch a computer named Watson compete on the trivia show Jeopardy against the two strongest champions in the show's history. Watson didn't just win. It demolished both opponents so convincingly that one of them, Ken Jennings, wrote under his final answer, "I, for one, welcome our new computer overlords." The line went viral instantly. For IBM, it was the perfect marketing moment. The very next day, the company released an ad promising that Watson's abilities would be applied to healthcare, finance, law, and academia, essentially any field where analyzing huge amounts of text mattered. IBM leadership saw a $200 billion market opportunity ahead, and the single biggest priority became healthcare, specifically oncology. The logic seemed airtight. Watson had shown it could parse tricky, ambiguous human language faster and more accurately than a person. So why not point that same ability at millions of medical studies, patient histories, and clinical trials, and help doctors make better decisions about cancer treatment? IBM started aggressively buying up companies that worked with medical data and pouring billions of dollars into building the Watson Health division. Partners included some of the top cancer centers in the U.S., including the well-known MD Anderson Cancer Center. And that's where the problem started. It turned out the gap between winning a trivia show and giving reliable cancer treatment recommendations was much bigger than it looked on the marketing slides. Watson was, at its core, mostly symbolic AI with a light dusting of machine learning on top. A system trained to parse the structure of a question and find matching chunks of text, not a system capable of independently learning from real clinical experience in the messy, contradictory world of medicine. Practicing doctors started noticing that Watson's recommendations didn't always match real clinical practice, and in some cases turned out to be outright unsafe, based on hypothetical, synthetic training cases rather than real patient data. Medical centers began pulling out of their partnerships one after another. MD Anderson cut ties with IBM after an internal university audit raised doubts about the effectiveness and even the safety of the system's recommendations. And, in a fittingly symbolic moment, news of the split started buzzing on phones in the audience, while then IBM CEO Ginny Rometty was literally speaking at a major healthcare technology conference. The project wasn't just stalling, it was actively damaging IBM's reputation. Between 2019 and 2023, according to analyst estimates, the Watson saga cost the company roughly 10% of its stock value, and total spending on development, acquisitions, and marketing ended up being 4 times higher than any revenue the division ever generated. In January 2022, IBM quietly, with no fanfare, sold off the Watson Health assets to the private equity firm Francisco Partners for roughly $1 billion. For comparison, by various estimates, IBM had put around $5 billion into building that division. So an asset once billed as the future of medicine was ultimately sold at a massive discount. And this happened just months before the whole world started talking about a completely different kind of artificial intelligence. What's the telling detail here? Unlike Psych, Vicarious, or Viv Labs, Watson's failure wasn't about a lack of funding or one person's stubbornness. IBM had the resources, the reputation, access to the best hospitals in the world. The problem was more fundamental. Watson tried to pass itself off as a general-purpose system, equally capable of analyzing sports stats, legal documents, and cancer protocols, when in reality it was a narrowly specialized system built for a specific quiz show format, stretched by marketing onto tasks it was never truly built for. The irony is that the very transformer architecture that made a real breakthrough in language possible in 2017 and eventually led to GPT and ChatGPT is exactly the kind of technology Watson was catastrophically missing. Watson didn't lose because AI couldn't help in medicine. It lost because, at the time, the technology capable of truly understanding and generating language at the level required simply didn't exist yet. And finally, a story that stands apart from all the others, because it's a story of success. But it matters precisely because it shows what was missing everywhere else. 2010, London. Demis Hassabis, a former child chess prodigy, video game developer, and neuroscientist by training, founds DeepMind together with Shane Legg and Mustafa Suleyman. Their philosophy differed from many competitors. Instead of immediately trying to build a brain that understands everything, they started with a much narrower and more practical task: teaching a system to play old 1980s video games using a method called reinforcement learning. That sounds a lot less flashy than Viv's global brain or Psych's common sense. But that narrowness and specificity is exactly what let the team get real, measurable results, step by step, game by game. In 2014, Google acquires DeepMind for roughly $500 million, beating out a competing bid from Facebook. And here's where something happens that didn't happen with any other company in this video. Google gives DeepMind extraordinary autonomy. The lab stays in London, keeps its own structure and its own research culture, instead of dissolving inside the corporation the way Viv did. The results didn't take long to show up. In 2016, the AlphaGo system defeats World Go champion Lee Sedol, an event watched by more than 200 million people worldwide. It was the moment that genuinely changed how the general public perceived what artificial intelligence could actually do. But DeepMind didn't stop there. The team kept working on increasingly ambitious problems and eventually built AlphaFold, a system that learned to predict the three-dimensional structure of proteins with an accuracy that solved one of the hardest open problems in biology in the last 50 years. In 2024, that work earned Hassabis a Nobel Prize in chemistry. Why did DeepMind succeed where Psych, Vicarious, Viv Labs, and Watson didn't? Several factors overlap here. First, the approach through reinforcement learning and deep neural networks turned out to be exactly the kind of thing that actually scales. Unlike hand-coding knowledge the way Psych did, or forcing a quiz show system into medicine the way IBM did with Watson. Second, DeepMind chose specific, measurable tasks, games, then proteins, instead of a vague goal of general intelligence right away. And third, and this matters a lot, after the acquisition, Google didn't try to immediately turn DeepMind into a product for 1 billion users the way Samsung did with Viv. The company was given time to actually do research. Ironically, that research-first culture also meant DeepMind stayed relatively invisible to the general public for a long time. Unlike OpenAI, which chose a completely different path, get a product into the hands of millions of people as fast as possible. In April 2023, DeepMind merged with Google Brain into a single unit, Google DeepMind. And today that same team is behind the Gemini models, direct competitors to the very chatbots that kicked off the wave started by ChatGPT. What connects these 5 stories? Psych tried to hand-code common sense and got stuck in an endless, nearly impossible amount of work. Vicarious promised a human-level brain and ended up building real, but much more modest, robotic solutions for warehouses. Viv Labs had the right technology and the right team, but lost momentum once it got absorbed into a slow corporate machine. IBM Watson passed off a narrowly specialized system as general intelligence and paid for that ambition with billions of dollars and its reputation. And only DeepMind, by choosing a narrower, measurable path and getting enough autonomy inside a big company, eventually built something that genuinely changed the industry. When OpenAI released ChatGPT in November 2022, it wasn't an invention that came out of nowhere. It was the result of that same 2017 transformer architecture, refined for years by researchers all over the world, including people who came directly out of companies like the ones we just talked about. The real difference was something else. OpenAI didn't bet on the right technology for its own sake. It made a simple, almost naive move, putting a powerful language model directly into the hands of millions of ordinary people in the form of a chat. A step none of the previous companies had ever dared to take so openly and at such scale. So the next time you see a new AI startup with big headlines about AGI just around the corner and a roster of star investors, remember this story. Money and bold promises are not a guarantee of success. Sometimes the winner isn't the one with the grandest vision, but the one who finds the simplest way to prove real value to real people. If you enjoyed this video, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments. Which company or technology should we investigate next in a What Happened To episode? See you in the next video.